All right, folks, today is July 1st, 2021. Coming up on Roland Martin Unfiltered, Manhattan DA smacks the Trump Organization 15-count indictment. We're going to break down what it means. Oh, yeah, they're trying to hold that thug accountable for shady business dealings. Also, speaking of shady, the Supreme Court gut Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. conservatives on the court, making it a lot easier for Republicans to have voter suppression. Also, Speaker Nancy Pelosi, she's appointed Republican Liz Cheney to the January 6th Select Committee. It's going to be chaired by Congressman Benny Thompson of Mississippi, who, of course, is the chair of the Department of Homeland Security Committee. Folks, we got a jam-packed show for you. We'll also talk about Nicole Hannah-Jones getting tenure at the University of North Carolina. Will she take the job? It's time to bring the funk. I'm Roland Martin Unfiltered. Let's go.
He's got it. Whatever the biz, he's on it. Whatever it is, he's got the scoop, the fact, the find. And when it breaks, he's right on time. And it's rolling. Best believe he's knowing. Putting it down from sports to news to politics. With entertainment just for kicks, he's rolling. It's the go, y'all. It's Roland Martin, yeah. Rolling with Roland now. He's funk, he's fresh, he's real, the best, you know he's Roland Martin now.
All right, folks, welcome to Roland Martin Unfiltered. We have been telling you repeatedly, voting matters. Well, today, the Supreme Court, in a 6-3 ruling, made it clear that they will side with Republicans who want to make it harder to vote. What was before the court was a case out of Arizona that dealt with the issue of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Well, essentially what the Supreme Court did was invalidate Section 2, saying, yeah, we know there might be some disparities, but you know what? It's all good. The liberal justices, it had strong dissent, including Justice Elena Kagan, making it clear that this is an abomination of the Voting Rights Act, and it is Congress that actually passed that law. There's a reason why they did so. Let's go right to our panel and talk about this whole deal. Of course, we got Reese Colbert, Black Women Views. We got Dr. Greg Carr, of course, professor of African American history at Howard University. Also, of course, teaches, of course, there in their law school as well. Folks, and just give me 1 second here, because I'm just looking at, there's always breaking news, so I'm sort of setting this phone on vibrate so we're not completely interrupted during today's show. And so this, folks, is utterly confusing. Well, it's not confusing because we know exactly what goes on here in this country when it comes to voting. And Greg, this is no shock. This is what happens when you get Republicans who control the Supreme Court. That's why those 2 seats were so important that Mitch McConnell stole from President Barack Obama.
Yeah, absolutely, Roland. There were 2 cases today, one yesterday and today. The one that's not getting as much press is the Americans for Prosperity Foundation versus Bonta. That was a case out of California where John Roberts, using the First Amendment, Johnny Roberts, my man John Roberts, siding with the white nationalist, hardcore white nationalists, to basically say that the state of California cannot require these nonprofits to provide the names of their major donors. Americans for Prosperity, by the way, is a big beneficiary of Charles Koch. And they're the ones that sued, lost at the 2 levels. And then, as you say, got to the Supreme Court with those stolen seats. And John Roberts sided with them and said that they have an interest not to be harassed because people find out they gave money and then they're threatened. So he's creating a new protected class, billionaires. But the one we're talking about, the Brnovich versus DNC, and I was reading the opinion earlier today, and as you say, the dissent from Kagan, and it was a very long dissent, I think, because, of course, people understand when you're writing a dissent at the Supreme Court level, you're writing not necessarily to win the day today. You lost that, but you're writing so that in the future that can be used. That's what you see in Brown, for example. But, you know, Sam Alito, a good white nationalist who was hot to get in that Pennsylvania Supreme Court case. Remember that during the election? He really wanted to get after it. He brought up the specter again of voter fraud in his majority opinion, but he also set out, and understand, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act has usually been, in fact, this is the first case to go to court not about redistricting. That's usually what they use Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act to do, to challenge redistricting. That's because the 15th Amendment is there as well. And we could talk about that a little bit later. But this case brought up the process of discriminatory impact. There are two things that could be brought up. Discriminatory impact. In other words, did they pass these laws and will it have a discriminatory impact on minorities? Or was it purposeful? Did they do this with minorities in mind specifically? They didn't go after the discriminatory intent. They went after discriminatory impact. And what Alito said, and I'll stop here and then we can go back and forth and hear what Reese has to say about this as well. What Alito basically said is, look, there are many different ways to vote. It used to be you had to vote on election day. In fact, the first sentence of his opinion says Arizona law generally makes it very easy to vote. His thing is, if you show up to the wrong precinct, which is one of the two things they went after in Arizona, this whole notion of going to the wrong precinct. He said, if you go to the wrong precinct and you vote, hey, if they find out you're the wrong precinct, Arizona is within their rights to throw your vote away. He's basically saying, if y'all too stupid to show up at the wrong precinct, then Arizona is not on Arizona. They shifted the burden to the voter, and we can talk a lot more about it. But that's basically the core of it. They went after the voter in this case.
I want to bring in. Let's see here. For some reason, I am frozen. Can y'all hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so all right, so let me do this. Let me bring in. We were going to talk to him about the New York situation, but I want to bring him in right now because I know he has something to say about this as well. Lawrence Norton, he's the director of election reform program at the Brennan Center for Justice. They have been one of the leading voices out here dealing with this issue of election reform and dealing with what's happening with the attack on voting in this country. And Larry, it has to be extremely unsettling to see what the Supreme Court continues to do when it comes to these voting cases.
Sorry, Roland, I'm having trouble hearing you.
Can you hear me now?
A little bit, yeah. It's a little bit better.
I said it has to be unsettling to see the Supreme Court continue the path they're on when it comes to protecting the right to vote in this country. Yeah.
Look, I think the lesson from today is we're not going to be able to count on the courts to protect the right to vote. And it's a big reason why, there are two big voting rights bills in Congress right now. You have S1 for the PEOPLE Act and John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act that would both set minimum standards nationally so that states have less room to suppress the vote. And would also give the Department of Justice, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, more of a role in saying whether or not states can move forward with voter suppression laws. Today's decision makes it all the more clear that it's imperative that Congress take the lead here and move to protect voting rights. We're not going to be able to count on the Supreme Court to step in the future.
And the thing here, that we have to understand, Lawrence, is that by having that 6th vote, look, even if one of those justices decides to step in, it's going to be 5-4, and we see Alito staunchly. Look, Clarence Thomas has said he wants to get rid of the Voting Rights Act. Okay, these conservatives, they have despised the Voting Rights Act since 1965. And then to hear Republicans say, oh, if Democrats keep doing this, it's going to hurt us from elected Republicans. They basically put it in their lawsuit, hey, we need to be able to essentially cheat in order to compete. Lawrence, did you hear me?
Yeah, look, this is why I say the court made clear today. It's, the court traditionally, historically, at least in the recent past, and I should say, actually, if you look way back, the court, of course, has not been a friend to voting rights or to civil rights. But, I think a lot of Americans got used to in the past 30, 40 years, that the Supreme Court's going to step in and make sure that there can't be the kind of blatant voter suppression laws that we're starting to see passed around the country, particularly this year. They're not going to be there anymore. With this, there's a 6-3 majority now that is fairly hostile to voting rights. While certainly we should be able to continue to go to the courts to fight for our rights, Congress is, and by the way, this Supreme Court has recognized this. Congress is going to be the backstop to ensure that all Americans have the right to vote in federal elections. So at the end of the day, this is very frustrating. On the other hand, we had 50 Democratic senators vote to proceed on For the People Act. It was filibustered. I think we're going to see similar numbers, 50, 51 senators say that they're in favor of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which is also very important. We're gonna have to see whether or not the Democrats decide that they're gonna get rid of the filibuster to pass these two pieces of legislation, because they're not going to be able to rely on the courts to save them going forward in the way that they might have in the past.
Reese Colbert, I want to bring you in. Reese, can you hear me? Reese, can you hear me?
Couldn't hear you, Reese. You're on mute.
Reese, I can't hear you.
She was on mute for a minute, bro. Let's see now.
Hey, can you guys?
There
Yes.
we go. Now we got you, Reese.
All right.
We got you. For all of the people, Reese, who keep we saw this crap in 2016 and 2020 about, when it comes to voting, understand, they better understand what's going on here. Republican strategy is to try to control who votes at every level, because they understand the demographics are changing and it's not in their favor. And the Supreme Court has just said y'all can make it harder to keep for folks from voting.
Absolutely. And here's what's so troubling to me is what this Supreme Court has basically told the Republican legislatures is you have free reign to implement whatever kind of restrictive voting measures. And they understand that the Congress is unlikely to pass any kind of voting reforms. And what's really troubling and scary about this is going back to this whole January 6th commission and the big lie about the election. Republicans are using the Republican talking points about the election being stolen and about this fraudulent claim of voter fraud to implement these restrictions, and there's really nothing to stop them at this point. I mean, I think that it's positive that President Joe Biden is putting more and more people on the federal court, so at least there might be some backstop on the lower courts before it gets to the Supreme Court. But if it gets to the Supreme Court, then it's game over for voting rights. And so the Democrats have to do something. I don't know what they can do. I know people are tired of saying do something, Democrats, but what other choice do they have? On the other hand, I think, though, what is really important to understand is we have time to prepare for these voter suppression tactics. And I think that these voter suppression tactics really backfired big time for Republicans in 2020. Like, for instance, they discouraged the Republicans, from voting for absentee balloting. And typically Republicans have large numbers for absentee voting. And that made the difference in Georgia when those absentee ballots came in those black areas and Biden and Harris pulled out the victory in Georgia. It made the difference as well when it came to the Senate races down there in Georgia. And so the more that the Republicans attack the sanctity of the vote, the more they're actually suppressing their base as well as the Democratic base. As long as the Democrats can somewhat counter it by educating voters, by making sure that they are fighting back as much as they can in the courts, and if they can in Congress, I think Democrats will understand that they have to work that much harder to vote. The problem, or the biggest imperative that faces the Democrats, in addition to trying to get some voting rights passed, is giving people a reason to turn out in 2022. If you can get your base energized, they will turn out and they will win. And that's what 2020 showed, irrespective of what the Republicans try to pull.
Greg, I want to read this. Can you hear me, Greg?
Yes, sir.
Just for folks, I'm still having some computer issues over here, so folks, I apologize. But you can at least still hear me. We'll figure out what's going on with my video. As I say, we're moving to new office space, and so we're using StreamYard completely, and it is not going exactly how it's supposed to go. But you can at least hear me. This is the statement that Kristen Sinema, one of two senators from Arizona, actually announced today. This was her response to the Supreme Court decision, Greg. The right to vote, faith in the integrity of our electoral process, and trust in elected officials are critical to the health and vitality of our democracy. Today's ruling will hurt Arizonians' ability to make their voices heard at the ballot box. Congress must come together to strengthen the Voting Rights Act and protect every American's right to vote by passing common sense legislation, including the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which I am proud to co-sponsor. Greg, the reason this is a bullshit statement, it's real simple here. If she and Senator Joe Manchin would actually end the filibuster, they can pass the For the People Act, they can pass the John Lewis Act to stop a lot of this. And so I'm sorry, this statement isn't worth me scraping doo-doo off of my shoe.
Roland, I think, it's difficult for us to see a thing up close in the light of history and momentum. And I think, Reese, what you just said makes so much sense. The solution to this doesn't lie in the present or the future. The solution lies in the past. So when you look at citizenship education, like what Senator McCarthy did in South Carolina, and the whole idea of preparing people. See, Sam Alito, what they didn't do in today's opinion, what Alito didn't say, is that the Voting Rights Act is garbage. They can't go that far yet. So what he said is, hey, listen, it's easier to vote now than it was 20 or 30 years ago when you had to show up on election day and all this kind of thing. And as Kagan says in the dissent, but really what they're after, this out of precinct argument that if you are not in the right precinct and you vote, even your vote for president, vice president, and here's where Sinema comes in, U.S. Senate, which doesn't rely on being in a particular precinct, gets thrown out. Kristen Sinema's statement in that context makes a lot of sense. It may not be BS. Why? Because you know who gets harmed today? Kristen Sinema. So inch by inch, we're inching toward a confrontation. And what we have to understand, like you just said, Reese, we have to get our voters out. We have to get our voters educated. We got to make sure you know where to go, or take advantage of those weeks of early voting, which is what Alito is hanging his hat on. You have to show up. If you didn't early vote, there are many different ways you can do this. Finally, and here's where it's very interesting. Neither the For the People Act or the John Lewis Act has language, and the John Lewis Act is, as you say, Lawrence, specifically targeted at the Voting Rights Act, reestablishing preclearance, changing that formula, making it larger. But neither of those pieces of legislation address what these state legislatures are trying to do. And remember, the Georgia case is now going to work its way through the federal courts, which is take away local control of elections and move it into the state legislatures so that even if you do outvote somebody, they can put themselves in a position to steal the election anyway or overturn it at the state level. This battle is far from over. I'm really encouraged in many ways. And the solution to this looks like what we did in the 1960s and 70s, which is you get your people registered, you find out where they are, and then you press and you destroy this by overwhelming them in their capacity to steal with people who know exactly where to vote or know exactly what strategy to pursue and then go out and do it.
And Lawrence, the thing that we're seeing here when we talk about how you must prepare, for people who don't understand the shenanigans in Arizona, the Republican Party in Arizona is so sick and demented that they have stripped the authority over the elections from the Secretary of State, given it to the Republican Attorney General until January 1 of 2023, when the term of the democratically elected Secretary of State ends. That's the kind of heinous actions they are taking in order to, yes, in my language, steal elections.
Yeah, that provision in Arizona is crazy. Basically, they're saying that the Attorney General is the only one that can defend actions, which the Secretary has done before when there are lawsuits that are brought against around elections. And as you said, it's only for the period of time that the Democratic Secretary is in office. So it's pretty blatant what they're doing there. And I do think that that is likely to end up, by the way, in court. We'll see what the courts do with it. But I think there's, even with where the courts are right now, I think there's in that case, there's a pretty good claim to be brought that is not constitutional. But I do think more broadly, there is this issue of, trying to change the rules in whatever way possible to preserve power. And that's very dangerous for our democracy. It's true. You can't deal with everything through federal legislation, but the more we can do to create some kind of basic standards is really important. I totally agree with what everybody is saying here. At the end of the day, what this comes down to is a show of force at the ballot box and a repudiation of these kinds of tactics. And the Washington Post had a poll today that I think is very telling, that huge majorities of the country think access to the polls is more important than the Republican line about beating back fraud. So the other thing I'm hopeful is that we get the message out to people about what's really happening here, and that motivates people to get to the ballot box and push back.
I do want to get your thoughts, Lawrence, on what the hell is going on in New York with the mayoral election. You were both to discuss that. I want to talk about that. I mean, seriously, do we know how to count?
Yeah, I got to say, the New York City Board of Elections has had problems for a long time. It's a little bit, it's a unique situation in New York. The structure basically means the board is unaccountable to anybody. And the results has been, election after election, there are major problems. So in this one, of course, they didn't know how to count. They ran test ballots and they included those in the totals. And so they added 135,000 ballots when they shouldn't have. But, in 2020, anybody who lives in New York remembers they finally got early voting in New York City, and there were massive lines because they weren't prepared for it. We had huge numbers of mail ballots rejected. The board of elections in New York City, there are 10 members on the board. They're appointed by political party bosses in 5 different boroughs. So nobody's really accountable to anybody. The city funds them, but they're governed by state law, and there needs to be a change in the structure there. The entire board needs to be reformed. And I think one of the problems that we've had in New York is that a lot of politicians have said, well, at the end of the day, who's really hurt by this? And I think what we're seeing right now is when you have something like this happen in New York City, it's the media capital of the country. It gets massive attention. And of course, it hurts the voters in New York City, but frankly, it hurts everybody in the country because it gives fodder to people like Donald Trump and a lot of his other supporters who are looking to create confusion, sow doubt about elections generally, and they're using this as an example for that. I think New York is unique in a bad way in terms of election administration. It doesn't mean anything. And of course, they caught the problem very quickly, and we have paper ballots, so we can always go back. But those are details. The big message that somebody like Donald Trump now gets to say is, "Oh, we can't trust elections." That's their goal,
right?
And that's very dangerous.
Right, absolutely there. And that, to me, I think an issue. And so I dare say this here. This is where the folks at Black Voters Matter and other places, this is where they need to be protesting in New York City, because this is where Democrats need to be called out for their shenanigans in New York, because they've had some of the most ridiculous voting laws in that state. I don't care if they're Democrat. I don't care if they say, hey, it's us keep winning. No, the voting laws in New York City and New York State suck, and they need to be put on blast, just like Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi and Texas and Tennessee and Florida and everywhere else. That, Reese, has to happen.
Absolutely. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, I think New York just recently got early voting. I could be wrong about that, but I'm sorry. Did somebody say something?
No,
Yeah.
I'm agreeing with you.
Yeah, right. So I mean, they still have pretty archaic voting laws. And I think part of the problem here, though, we have to be honest, is our appetite for instant results. And with ranked choice voting, that's just not going to happen. It's a very complicated process. There are a lot of ballots to count. It's very intricate in terms of different rankings and then ballots falling off, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that people do need to kind of cool it a little bit and wait for the votes to be counted. That was one of the things that happened in the 2020 election. Count all the votes. I mean, Donald Trump said that because he thought he was going to win. And then we said that because we thought we were going to win. We did win. Our side won. But I think that, it does, to everybody's point, it definitely does engender skepticism and cynicism about the process. Even when you catch errors, it still makes it seem like something funny is afoot. But the one other thing I did want to talk about, too, a little bit is about the Andrew Yang and Garcia alliance. And I think we saw that rear its head in terms of Garcia overtaking Maya Wiley for second place, at least for now. There's still 120 something thousand ballots that need to be counted. And so I think that in addition to needing to understand the process better, a lot of ballots did not contain full rankings. So some people chose not to rank Adams or Wiley or Garcia or whoever else. So there's that goes to voter education or maybe just voter preferences. It's a little bit of both. But I also think it goes to strategy. The Yang Garcia alliance